What's the most effed up thing you saw at a sleepover? Story 1. At around midnight, our host's dad opened the door at the top of the basement stairs and asked if we wanted snacks. But before he could finish, he came tumbling down the stairs and hit his head hard. We heard some delirious yelling from the top of the stairs, and I innocently assumed it was his wife, scared because her husband had tripped. However, as my friend later explained to me, our host's mother had been drinking and had actually pushed her husband down the stairs in an attempt to kill him. So there I was, a witness to a wife trying to kill her husband. Story 2. I was staying at my girlfriend's apartment one night and I was woken up by a very loud sound. I got up and looked around, but everything was normal and she was still asleep, so I thought whatever I saw must have been imagined. After falling back asleep, we were both woken up by the police banging on the door. The sound I heard was a gunshot hitting her apartment, fired off by a crack addict attempting to commit suicide in the parking lot. Story 3. When I was in elementary school, I got invited with my sister to a birthday party of one of her friends. Everything was going splendidly for the most part until disaster struck. Her mom came down to the basement looking distraught, but she didn't explain why. She then had each of us line up on the stairs from the basement to the ground level of the house and brought us in one by one. No one was telling us what happened as they left. Finally, it was my turn. Her mom took me into the bathroom and showed me a trash can with poop in it. She was practically in tears, pointing to the trash can and asking me, "Is this your poop? Is this your poop?" Of course it wasn't. We never found out whose it was, and I was never told. We have joked that someone will eventually confess to the deed on their deathbed, but my sister and I have since lost contact with those girls, so the mystery may never be solved. Story 4. At the age of 13 or 14, I experienced a traumatic event that I will never forget. It was the middle of the night when I was staying over at my friend's house with two other girls. All of a sudden, we were startled by a loud popping noise coming from her brother's room. Our curiosity got the best of us, so the four of us decided to investigate. Just as we were entering his room, we were stopped by her mother in a state of panic. It took a few moments for my brain to process what had happened. Her brother had shot himself in the chest. Fortunately, he survived, but the experience left me with nightmares. After that night, I never stayed over at someone else's house again. Story 5. In our first year of secondary school, we went on a bonding trip to a summer camp for the weekend. With about 200 11 and 12-year-olds in our year group, we all were split into gender-separated dormitories with bunk beds, around 30 to a room. Once the lights were out, it was just us kids with no teachers around. Someone farted and it was hilarious, and then another, and a few more. What came next, however, was not so funny. A panicked voice said, "Oh!" and it was clear what had happened. One of us had soiled himself. I'm also reminded of this poor kid's second public shitting incident, which happened during our Duke of Edinburgh Award overnight expedition while we were camping in a tent together. That's a story for another time. Story 6. I grew up in a very rural area of the southern U.S., and at a sleepover when I was in middle school, my girlfriend's mother shockingly announced that she could speak to the spirits of dead people through her daughter. She proceeded to get her daughter drunk on wine and hypnotize her, and for what felt like an eternity, the mom incessantly demanded for spirits to speak through her daughter. Her daughter admitted to all sorts of horrific things, supposedly from the spirits speaking through her. Even though it has been over 30 years since this happened, I still remember it vividly. I remember the mom chain-smoking in a chair and her daughter slumped over in a chair, looking dog-drunk and slurring out confessions of murder, suicide, and being killed. She also mentioned that sometimes the spirits would manifest in such a way that her daughter would become violent and tear the house up. It was all so bizarre, as her daughter was usually so quiet, and the things that came out of her mouth were so unlike her. Story 7. I had a friend whose dad had a fish tank full of piranhas. I was desperate to feed them a hot dog, but her dad told me they had already eaten. That night, I snuck down to where the tank was located and discovered the tank was full of freshly picked fish bones. Just then, her dad appeared, having spotted me, and asked if I still wanted to feed the piranha. Being a small child totally enthralled with these dangerous fish, I eagerly nodded, producing the hot dog I had saved from the barbecue dinner we'd had earlier. It was a combination of fear and amazement as I watched 3 piranhas tear into the hot dog. I can honestly say that I never wanted to witness such a sight again, least of all in person. 10 out of 10 would not recommend. Story 8. When I was around 9 or 10, I spent the night at a friend's house. I knew his mom had a strict disposition, but I was completely unprepared for how severe it was. He'd done something minor, like leaving his socks in the living room, and she started yelling at him like he'd pooped on the floor. Later that evening, he managed to set her off again, and she went ballistic, whacking him so hard it scared me. She was a mad woman, banging and bellowing like there was no tomorrow. After that night, I couldn't stand her. I have no idea what became of that guy. We moved away shortly after, and searching for him online under his common name is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. To make matters worse, there's another guy with the same name who was murdered in the same town, but thankfully it wasn't him. Story 9. I was staying at my buddy's house when his dad unexpectedly arrived. His parents were in the process of getting divorced, but it hadn't been finalized yet. Apparently his mom had a new beau over, and his dad found out. The next thing I knew, we were huddled in the basement listening to his dad pounding on the front door, screaming at the top of his lungs, while his mom and her boyfriend yelled back. Eventually, the cops were called, and his dad was taken away for disturbing the peace, or something like that. After it was all over, his mom came down to the basement as if nothing had happened, and asked if we wanted a snack or something. I was beyond ready to just go home. Story 10. At 15, I was invited to a sleepover at my cousin's congregation, hosted by a couple with one young son. When we arrived, the wife provided snacks and then vanished, leaving the 30-something dad to keep us company. He seemed to think nothing of offering us sips of his Kahlua drink and leaving the liquor cabinet open. Even at the time, I felt uneasy, though I didn't realize why until much later. The basement was furnished and carpeted. There was nothing creepy about it. Story 11. When I was 15, I was staying at my girlfriend's house. Her dad attempted to be cool by buying us wine coolers, so we spent the night drinking and listening to music in her room. I was startled when I walked out into the hallway, and he popped up right in front of me. He got too close and handsy, so I had to take action. I'd been dealing with dodging my mom's sugar daddies and boyfriends for years, so I knew what to do. I quickly escaped into the bathroom and pretended to be sick until he left the hallway. I was still friends with her until college, but I took extra precautions to never be alone with her dad again. Surprisingly, he had attempted the same thing with other friends of hers, and we never discussed it until much later. Story 12. My friend had a truly harrowing experience at his friend's house after the baby shower. His friend's pregnant girlfriend was recklessly drinking and smoking weed, and my friend was horrified to discover maggots crawling along the floor. Unable to bear the thought of sleeping on the floor with the maggots, he was forced to sleep in his car. Story 13. When I was in 4th grade, I had my first sleepover at a friend's house. Me and 2 other girls were having a great time, the usual goofing around and eating popcorn, when I accidentally spilled some kernels down my shirt. We all ran to the bathroom laughing, trying to get the kernels out. Some ended up in the sink. But when her older high school brother found out, he flew into a rage and proceeded to beat her up. Me and the other girls ran to her room and shut the door. All we heard were her screams. I felt so terrible, like I had done something wrong, and I just wanted to disappear. Eventually, she came into the room, red and covered in tears. We never talked about it again, and it would be many years before I stayed the night at someone else's house again.